Hello, AP World History at University High School. This is another edition of Notes, and we are going to be talking about the Han Dynasty in China. This is sort of like the one of the golden ages, maybe, of Chinese civilization. Take a look at this map here. This is um, this is like the extent of Han conquest, if you will, during during the period. And of course, this line up near the top there is the Great Wall. It's not one single wall actually, and it was begun. I don't know when it was begun, but definitely in the BC period. Also by the Qin dynasty that preceded them. The Qin dynasty was the first to unify China, um, and the Han rulers continued it. I also want you to pay attention to this up here, the Xiongnu. These were these nomadic peoples northwest of China that continually gave the Chinese problems on the frontiers, and we'll talk about that. But look how far west they extended. They extended their dominion into this is the country of well, it's not a country, but it's the region of Tibet, which is part of China today. But most of Chinese civilization was out here with its capital at Chang'an right there. But they were able to conquer way out into this is really beginning to be Central Asia out here. And this is one of the reasons why they were able to extend, look at this yellow line, the Silk Roads. How about we do a little zoomage? Whoops. The Silk Roads. So they were able to make these connections and have a pretty important economic impact on China. We'll talk about that some more. So Chang'an is one of the largest cities in the world at that time in the 1st century. It's right around here. The Han Dynasty, the must-know dates, or the dates that encompass sort of the beginning and the end, are 205 BCE. That's with the fall of the Qin Dynasty. 205 BCE to 220 CE, so about 400 years, 425 years. It was around on planet Earth, and it was extremely important in Chinese civilization. First of all, it's an ethnicity in China. About 95, 96% of Chinese people are classified as Han Chinese. So Yao Ming and Jackie Chan and all these people are most likely Han Chinese. But China definitely has a whole lot more ethnic groups, and there isn't just one language spoken in China. There are many languages. The two most common are Mandarin and Cantonese. So yeah, so Chang'an, it's first of all, it's their center of administration. So the whole empire was really centered here, if you will. This is where the government or where the empire was governed from. In the way it's true of the Roman Empire for the city with the city of Rome as well, right? It had a bunch of walls protecting it. It was well fortified. The population is about 250,000 in the 1st century, which makes it one of, if not the largest city in the world at the time. And other cities were built throughout China off of the model of that city of Chang'an. Okay, so how were the Chinese emperors ruling such a vast land? So the dynastic cycle had played itself out. Qin Shi Huangdi, a pretty not well liked emperor. He was overthrown. He died, and after his death, as the dynastic cycle played out, a new dynasty rose to power based on different ideologies. So one of these emperors, and I picked him because he's considered one of the more important of Han rulers. Han Wudi ruled there in the 2nd and 1st century BCE. This represents a pretty big shift from the Qin dynasty, because the Qin dynasty, as we learned, ruled through the philosophy of legalism based on like strict rules and strict laws and harsh punishments for anyone who broke these laws. It viewed human nature as basically evil, whereas Confucianism sees human nature as pretty much good, and it seeks to cultivate certain virtues. Confucianism is based on certain relationships in nature, and if you observe that relationship, and if you observe your place in society, then there's harmony in society, and then there's going to be peace, and the economy is going to run well, and there's going to be obedience of the emperor, and the emperor is going to be just. So Han Wudi definitely utilized Confucianism to help rule the empire, and of course, most people were followers of Confucianism at that time. So what we're talking about is that he made Confucianism the state ideology. The state ideology. This helped him consolidate his rule. That is to bring his rule together and make it stronger by observing things like Confucian rituals, by practicing and encouraging certain Confucian virtues. All of these, of course, are laid out in the Analects of Confucianism. And they even went so far as to create an examination system, to select government bureaucrats or civil servants, as they're called, civil servants. So this was like it's not quite the civil service examination that becomes formalized later on during the Sui and Tang dynasties, but it's an examination that is similar to that. It's based on the Confucian classics. So this is how the civil servants would be chosen, these bureaucrats, based on how well that they know the Analects. And they study them for many, many years and then take this exam, and then they become part of the Chinese civil service. And as we learned before, this is going to be a continuity throughout Chinese history, is this idea of the mandate of heaven, that the emperor is seen as the son of heaven. And the emperor has a mandate from heaven, that is from nature, from the gods. And in this way, they claim to have a connection, that they're not actually God or anything like that, but they claim to have a connection to divinity. So the emperor is... this was a justification for their rule, right? And this is what allowed people also to perhaps have a justification to overthrow the emperor, because if there were rebellions, if they were being invaded by foreigners, or if there were constant earthquakes, or the economy was a mess, people could say that heaven has withdrawn its mandate, and therefore we can rebel. That's the idea behind the mandate of heaven. So that's one of the things that helps the dynastic cycle play out. Okay, so that's a little bit about how their administration was organized. And like the Romans, the Han Chinese depended on local officials throughout the empire to help rule the empire. So it's not like the emperor just made a decree and then everyone just sort of heard it and followed it. No, there were local officials throughout this very vast land. And these people that the Han chose to ally with and put in these government positions were this sort of second wealthy class. They were called gentry. So they were aristocratic, but not quite aristocratic. They weren't like the highest level of aristocrats. And these were the people from where the civil servants were chosen. They were chosen from this class, and that they were to be, they were going to be trustworthy, efficient, hardworking, and of course, because they're going to be guided by Confucian principles. So in that way, similar to the Romans. But of course, the emperor is the supreme lawgiver, similar to the way that happened during the Roman Empire. They also had the Han were able to extend their power and extend their dominion because the Qin dynasty was the first to unify China, but they didn't really conquer into deep south or way up north or even to the west. The Han dynasty was able to expand the dominion of China over neighboring people. So they fought these 3 wars against these people called the Xiongnu, and here they are northwest of China. They're these nomadic people. They were really good horsemen, fighters on horseback. Sometimes those people are just called the Huns for short, but they're not actually the Huns. Hun is just kind of also a general term that's used to refer to various people from like Central Asia that were nomadic, and they usually fought pretty well on horseback. But other groups of people that are going to come from that region are going to be like the Mongols later on. So that's going to be another pattern in Chinese history, is just continually having to deal with these nomadic, as they call them, barbarians on the frontiers. So they fought these 3 wars against the Xiongnu, and they were able to eventually defeat them. But they also had to continue to pay tribute to the Xiongnu to essentially just kind of like keep them at bay, to just keep them from continually causing trouble and raiding Chinese farmland up there in the northwest. And one of the ways that they tried to do that and continually protect them as well, protect themselves from the Xiongnu, is by extending the Great Wall. The Han also encouraged assimilation of conquered people. It is to like bring them into Chinese culture, if you will. This makes it easier, right, to govern them if they follow Confucian values, which is what the government is based on, right? If they speak the Chinese language and they read the Chinese pictographs. So the way they were able to encourage this assimilation, that's a nice AP World History term there for you, is by also encouraging intermarriage with these conquered people. That's similar to the Roman process of what the Romans did with Romanization, right? That would better help the Romans govern their empire if people spoke the same language and they followed Roman legal codes and institutions and things like that. It's the spread of Roman culture. So the Chinese tended to do that as well, where they assimilated conquered peoples into Chinese culture. So let's talk more about trade. Um, I don't know when this was. Somewhere, I don't know, just BCE or CE, because again, the Han Dynasty is 205 BCE to 220 CE. They sent these ambassadors to Central Asia, to cities like Samarkand. Samarkand is an important oasis trade city in Central Asia. That is, it was an important center for trade and like a stopping off point for people who were traveling long distances to trade goods along the Silk Roads. So they sent these ambassadors out there to initially to just seek assistance against the Xiongnu, to possibly purchase horses or to make a military alliance with some of those people to defeat the Xiongnu. They failed to make any military alliances, but what ended up coming out of it was through these contacts, they ended up establishing a system of roads linking East Asia with Central Asia. And these are what we would call the Silk Roads later on. And because of these roads, which again were built by the government, which encouraged long distance trade, silk production became a huge industry in China. Demand grew, profits grew tremendously, and a lot more people began to be engaged in silk production. So much so that the Chinese made it a state secret because it was such an important industry for them that they wanted to make sure that the method of production didn't spread to other places. So again, it was the state that helped establish these economic connections, which again is going to then increase like the economic prosperity of Chinese citizens and therefore keep them nice and happy, right? Where's Samarkand? There's Samarkand way out in Central Asia. I think it's in Uzbekistan today, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll study this map later on once we get to Chapter 7 and these long-distance systems of trade that connected, look, China all the way into the Middle East and therefore, as a result, into the Mediterranean. So Romans and the Chinese definitely did trade goods between one another. Did they trade directly with one another? No, that was probably extremely rare. I don't know if it ever happened that the Romans went all the way to China or vice versa. But the goods from the Mediterranean certainly ended up in China, and silks from China definitely ended up in the Roman Empire. So here you see we've got like a mural that was found somewhere in China. It was painted in the 7th century, but it shows this expedition from 138 to 126 BCE to establish connections with Central Asia. Okay, lastly, Chinese technology. The Chinese had superior technology in the classical world. They had invented so many things that had economic impacts, social impacts, and even political impacts. So they developed the use of steel. First of all, this is going to be stronger than iron. That's going to give them it's going to make stronger weapons first of all, and give them an advantage over enemies. An improved water, or they're going to invent the water mill, which is going to improve farming output. Better horse collar, which also is going to improve farming output, and also, well, I mean, yeah, that mainly. So horses aren't going to be is choked when they're pulling a plow, for example. They invented paper. This is going to be huge, a huge invention in world history. And they also built an extensive system of roads. They continued off the pattern of the Qin dynasty and continued constructing a whole series of canals. So when you're looking at something like this, yes, it seems like the Chinese are very inventive and um, ingenious with technology, but the big question is, who cares? So what? The big question is, like, what social, economic, and political connections can you make with all that stuff? Because on the AP exam, you're never going to have a question about, like, compare the technology of Rome and the technology of China, but instead it'll be something like compare how technology influenced the economic growth of China, or how it allowed for political, I don't know, administration or something like that. So they're almost always going to ask for connections. So when you're talking about steel, again, that's going to give them an advantage over neighboring peoples in warfare. It's going to help them conquer better and therefore, like, control and administer this large empire. The water mill is going to improve farming output, which is going to then have, well, it's going to make farmers wealthier. It's going to increase the population because food supply is going to increase. So it has demographic and environmental effects. Same thing with the horse collar. Paper. Gosh, you can do all sorts of stuff with paper. I mean, in like an essay to explain. Like it's gonna help better. It's gonna keep better records, right? So it's obviously going to be useful for record keeping, which is going to help the government collect taxes, administer laws, take censuses. In short, it's going to help them administer the empire better, right? Um, Extensive system of roads. Well, why do you think roads are initially going to be constructed? Just like in the Roman Empire, it's initially to move around troops. But then, so obviously that's going to help them govern the empire better, protect the empire as well. But in addition to that, roads are going to facilitate economic growth, right? As it's going to help people and goods move around. And the same thing with canals. So you see, all of these things have connections beyond the fact that they're just, inventions on their own. Let's see, I think we are done, but one last thing that I didn't mention, I thought I'd put in here, um, is like the Romans, the Han, it conquered neighbors and um, would exact tribute from them. They conquered parts of Korea and all the way down into southern China as well. I think that's it for now. Thank you very much for coming and learning, and we'll see you guys next time.